enjoyed the end of the last story. The next story I'm going to start now, is called Assipattle and the Mester Stoorworm. The Mester Stoorworm. Now what could that be? Okay, Assipattle. Who's he? There's a bit of explaining to do before we start the story. If you look at the map beside me over here, you can see the top of Scotland. You can see the Orkney Islands where Earl Paul and Earl Harold lived. Out beyond those are the Shetlands. And up to the northwest, a very interesting little group of islands called the Faroe Islands. Not the Fairy Islands, but the Faroe Islands. And out beyond there, the bigger island of Iceland, the Iceland Island. If you look the other way, you can see Norway coming down, Denmark sticking up. And do you see the way the sea curls around the top of Denmark? It goes around the border of Norway and then back up again by Sweden. Well, a long time ago, people used to look at the world around them and try to figure out, why is it the way it is? Where did everything come from and why is it like this? In some places in the world, like the places like what we now call Iraq and places like that, people used to use a lot of a story, but they also use science to try and figure out. They would have hypotheses, you know, they'd think why something was a particular way and do experiments. And they were very interested in, you know, how far away is the sun? How big is the earth? And they did pretty good experiments back then, and also in ancient Greece and places like that, to try and figure it out. And they also had some pretty good stories, but in other parts of the world, people just use stories to try and figure out why the world was the way it was. And they would look around and they saw these islands and they saw the sea was like that, and they would think, how did it get to be like that? And somebody somewhere would come up with an explanation. And this story explains a lot of things. It's called Assipattle and the Mester Stoorworm. Long, long ago, long before Earl Harold and Earl Paul, even further back in time before that, this story takes place on the Orkneys. And at that time there was a king of the Orkneys, and the thing happened to that king that happens to so many kings. He was happily married. He had his beautiful daughter Gwendolen. Something happened to his wife, and when he remarried his new wife, the new queen, she was not a kind person. She was a wicked person. She was vain and bad and unkind. The king couldn't see it though. Everybody else could see it, but not him. And Gwendolen was a little bit afraid of her. And all the good people who lived in the island of Orkney at the time, they loved the king and they loved Gwendolen, but they were a little bit pretty much unsure of the queen. They knew that she wasn't such a great person. Well, our family and our story with the characters in it, they were farmers. There was the mum and dad had 7 boys. 7 and 1 girl. There were 6 boys, then the girl, and then they had 1 more boy. And this boy was very lazy. He didn't do any work. All the other boys were out in the fields working. He never did anything. He was such a lazy boy. And in those days, people, one thing that was different in the old days was there was almost no trash. You know how we did this trash survey at school and it was all the plastic and everything? Well, back in the old days up in the islands there, most of the food that people ate, they caught it themselves, like fish or whatever. They even ate birds, like seagulls and stuff like that. They grew some crops in the fields, although it wasn't that easy to grow things up in Orkney because it was cold and very windy, and the soil wasn't that good up there. But they grew some stuff, and they didn't really buy anything that came in packaging. So when they were finished with whatever they had, the leftovers, that would just be bio stuff. And they had a big bio trash pile called a midden. Okay? And the midden was just full of all the bones, like chicken bones and you know, skins from potatoes and things like that. And the other thing that was in the midden was when they finished with their fire at the end of the day, I don't know if you've ever had seen a real fire burning, but at the end there's lots of grey ash. And they would scrape all the ash out and throw it on the midden. And it was a big bio bin, basically, that they had. And ash is actually quite good for the soil, so it would mix with all the bio trash and they could put it on the soil. And Assipattle loved nothing more than to roll about in the midden. Like, why did he do that? I don't know, but he did. And he was all covered in dust from the ash, and that's where the Assi part comes from in his name, Assipattle. Okay, Assipattle. A little bit like in Cinderella, she was always hiding behind this big pot by the fire and getting the cinders on her, which were like the ash from the fire. So he got his name in the same way as Cinderella, but this story, nothing to do with Cinderella. And his older brothers, they really disliked him. They just saw him as a little annoying, lazy boy. And every time they passed him, they would give him a good old slap around the head, or they would throw things at him. They would say mean things to him or give him a kick. And they just called him the laziest person ever. And they really didn't like him at all. He was very different to the rest of them. His mind was full of stories. Kings, princes, witches, monsters, everything. And in the stories that he made up, he was always the hero. He was like a knight with a silver breastplate and a big sword and a shield, and he'd be conquering monsters and everything. And his brothers would just laugh at him and then get angry and throw mud at him and things like that. Tell him to be quiet and stop coming up with such nonsense. And the only person that was ever in any way kind to him was the sister. Okay, she saw that he actually had a good heart and she was quite kind to him. So that was the situation. So one day, across the sea, came the terrible Mester Stoorworm. Now you have to know one thing about Scotland in the old days. Any creature that was long and slim they just called it a worm. They didn't say it was a snake or whatever, they just said worm. So the Mester Stoorworm was a long, massive, long creature that swam in the sea. Like, imagine something like a sea snake, but with 4 very short legs, but with webbed feet so that it could swim. And not a snake head, but imagine a head like a dragon head. Okay? Gigantic yellow eyes with black slits down them that never blinked, just staring the whole time. And when the Mester Stoorworm opened its fanged mouth, a long tongue could come out with 2 big forks on the end and scrape up anything from the beach. Anybody who happened to be standing would just scrape them up and pull them into its mouth. And then whenever it wanted to, the Mester Stoorworm could open its mouth and breathe out a horrible toxic gas that would just go across the fields, and all the animals, any animal that was in its way would be killed immediately. The grass would wither. Trees, apples would just fall from trees, and the apples would be poisonous if you tried to eat them. Everything was destroyed by the Mester Stoorworm. And so one day, unfortunately for the people of Orkney, the Mester Stoorworm swam in, and its huge head was resting down by the beach, and it was looking around from side to side. Its tongue was coming out and licking up. It licked up a few sheep from the beach and ate them up. It started to breathe on the land. Trees were all dying and grass was wilting and turning brown. And everybody was getting very, very worried about this. All of the local people who lived around there, they all fled away from the Mester Stoorworm, and everybody ran up to the big castle, and they were outside of the castle, the king's castle, saying, "The Mester Stoorworm is here. You have to do something. You have to do something. Save us from the Mester Stoorworm." And the king looked out. He was quite an old king by this point. He looked out from his castle and he looked down. He could see over the hills and the fields, and some brown fields where the Mester Stoorworm had already breathed on them. And he could see the beach, and he could see out in the water the huge head of the Mester Stoorworm with its 2 gigantic yellow eyes, staring inland, and its big tongue lolling around in the water. And the king, he was afraid. He was afraid for everybody and his people. And he realized there was a crisis. A terrible crisis. That means when something really bad happens. And he gathered all his best people together in a big, he called it the fellowship, the crisis fellowship. And he gathered them all together, and he had all the clever people he could imagine all round about, very rich farmers who were up there, all the people who were traders, main traders trading with other islands who were very clever. He had those people there, and he had his wicked queen there as well. And the queen went around the whole time with a sorcerer. Now you know what a sorcerer is, right? It's like a magician. But a sorcerer, it's like a magician could be someone who just tricks or is entertaining or something like that. But the sorcerer tends to be a little bit, how can we say it, sneaky, okay? Not to be trusted, the sorcerer. And the sorcerer went around with the queen, and everywhere they went, people were a little bit afraid of them. They didn't know what the sorcerer or the queen were going to do next. And they sat there in this big group of important people as they decided, what will we do about the Mester Stoorworm? It's come here. Everybody's afraid of it. And nobody knew what to do, and everybody was looking towards the king. And the king was sitting at his table, looking at all those important people in front of him. And finally, it was the queen who stood up. I know what should be done, she said.